Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Sturt, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and young Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In season 2, we'll be chatting with young Canadians about their unconventional career trajectories and what it's like to be young entrepreneurial leaders. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Lucia Gallardo is a 2017 Venture for Canada Fellow alumni and a Honduran serial entrepreneur that bridges technology with justice and inclusion movements. She is the founder of Emerge, a socio-technology solutions development lab offering impact as a service for companies and governments looking to address pressing industry and global problems. She also co-founded TABIC, a community for nascent entrepreneurs in Latin America, and Dona Un Libro, an educational foundation taking on taboo issues such as undocumented immigration across Central America. She joined the advisory boards of Unity and Penta to spearhead their impact technology strategies. Lucia also co-chairs the International Expansion Council at Women Entrepreneurs Global, a startup innovation studio for female founders. She is also accepted to head up We Global's Exponential Technologies division. In her spare time, Lucia sits on a few advisory boards for an array of meaningful issues to her, such as Rainforest Partnership, the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance, and some early-stage ventures founded by persons of color and/or women. Lucia is an MIT Innovator Under 35 and a Royal Bank Canada Woman of Influence. Lucia, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. How are you?
I am doing pretty well, and that's great to hear that you're doing well also. I think in the whole context of the pandemic, as we tape in May 2021, doing as well as kind of under the circumstances. And as we were chatting before, I'm glad to hear that you're able to spend some time in Honduras with your family.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year for sure. And I'm also grateful that I get to spend the time with my family. It's a month that's really important to my family because it relates to my parents. There's Mother's Day or their anniversary, birthdays. So it's an exciting month to be home and then, back to work and hopefully I'll be able to see a little more of the world this year than I did last year.
Yeah, hopefully as we all get vaccinated, that later in 2021, it's going to be a little bit more normal than the last 14 months, but fingers crossed. If one thing COVID has taught us, there is a lot of uncertainty. So to start our conversation, can you give our listeners a high-level overview of your startup Emerge?
Sure. So we function like a design and development studio. Generally, organizations will come to us with a particular problem that they're trying to address. That might be, for example, optimizing their supply chain, or it might be that they want to distribute public services in a more efficient way or in a more transparent way. And then what we do is we take a collection of different types of technology and we try to build a solution that will work for them and will address the problem along with meeting targets that are aligned with the UN SDGs. So we do a lot of work that's aligned with the UN SDGs, and we've done work with government ministries and private companies and some coalitions and other groups that are really looking to solve these private sector problems or industry problems in a way that philosophically is also a public good.
For our listeners, can you define UN SDGs and why they're important?
Sure. So those are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They are a laundry list of the world's more pressing problems. And they range from reducing poverty and gender inequality or all types of inequality to addressing deforestation and destruction to marine life. They include things like improving the quality of our education and healthcare access and things like that. So the list of 17 problems that are really intended to boost the quality of life for people all over the world. And they're really important because they help all countries and persons alike sort of commit to and work toward a particular set of targets that will really have meaningful impact for people around the world. And so we're hoping that, the more awareness is raised about the UN SDGs, the more people and companies and key stakeholders can work toward achieving those targets.
I agree. I think the UN SDGs is something that everybody should know about. And it's something, unfortunately, that is still a lot of people don't know about, but I think is a great framework for assessing impact for any organization, a government, for-profit, not-for-profit. One thing kind of on the topic of Emerge is, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your founding story and how you came to create the company.
Sure. I like to joke that it was started when I was 8, because I've always been very, very passionate about justice and inclusion and understanding inequity and inequality. And so over time, I had sort of taken the route of the public sector and tried to understand it from a development perspective. But as I sort of got my first jobs in Canadian tech, I was living in Montreal at the time, I started to fall in love with the way that technology could be used to address all kinds of problems, really. But I was a little bit frustrated at the fact that I was working on consumer problems rather than, I guess, societal problems. So the company was really born out of that desire. And I remember having, been accepted into Venture for Canada was kind of like a catalyst because I knew where I was going. And I think I've always respected this that you've told me, which is that this notion that, VFC is for two kinds of people. One is the person that has no idea that they're born to be an entrepreneur and they sort of stumble into it and suddenly they've found so much meaning in their life through entrepreneurship. But then there's this other group of people that know exactly where they're headed into this route of entrepreneurship, and VFC really just helps catalyze them. And I fell always into that second group of people because I knew that I wanted to start a company. I knew what it wanted to do. I just needed some of the right tools and combinations of resources and people and things to do it. And so I started the company in 2018, which was around the time that I was in the middle of my fellowship. So it's been a long journey since then. And we now operate globally and we've got projects, about 18 projects now. So I'm really excited with how the company has grown. And I'm really grateful for every single resource and person and tool that VFC has provided along the way.
How has Emerge changed as a company since you founded it in 2018?
Oh, so much. I think in the beginning, a lot of it was, it was such a hard company to explain. And people kept saying we were crazy for trying to take on more than one product, more than one problem. We were thinking from the get-go just very, very ambitiously. And even though, a lot of people questioned what the common threads were with some of the products, like I had a very, very clear image of what I wanted to build. I just at the time wasn't great at maybe explaining it, or I think it just needed some refinement. So I think from then till now, it's just become, something that is much more clearly defined, where you can now see the common threads in the work that we do. I also think before we had a lot of projects that were born out of our own team that about issues that we were really passionate about. And then just slowly the company started getting all of these requests. And now we're doing a lot of work in which people sort of come with a problem already, and it's a defined problem. And we just sort of start responding to it. And that allows us to be really experimental with the solution and to reuse some components of architecture that we've used before. And I think it went from sort of being like its own little studio into becoming sort of half consultancy, half design studio. And I think I'm really excited by the possibilities of what we could do with that, because as more organizations come to us, we're able to find these common threads and maybe even get them to work together in some ways. So it's changed a fair bit in terms of business model, team makeup. It's changed a bit in terms of how we even define and describe the company. There are some things that have always held true, which are generally our commitment to, playing with frontier technology and democratizing access to this technology, and also our commitment to social good and the UN SDGs as like a guiding post for all of the work that we do.
I think your experience as an entrepreneur is similar to many people who launch different ventures, where often an idea evolves a lot over time. I can say in context of Venture for Canada, I've been doing Venture for Canada full-time for almost 7 years. And initially we started as just this solely on a fellowship program. And over 7 years, the fellowship program itself has evolved, but we now run half a dozen other programs, and in many ways, very different. VFC looks today very different than I thought it would have looked like 7 years ago. Yeah. And I think so many entrepreneurs, they launch companies and sometimes 10 years later, it can look completely different. Yes. Than what one initially set out to do.
I was hiring a chief of staff recently, and we were having our first onboarding call, and I made a list of all the things that are currently active. And as I was making that list, I guess because I spend my day context switching between all of the projects, I don't really think about the aggregate all that much unless I'm purposefully thinking about strategy. And so when I was making the list, I looked at the list and I'm like, this is everything we have going. And it was so difficult to reconcile 2018 to where we are now and the kinds of projects we were taking on. And as I was on that call, it was really just a moment of, I don't know, pride, but also just confusion at where we started and where we are now, I guess.
It's something I think that's so important is to reflect on the progress that takes place over time. And I think entrepreneurs can be very perfectionist in how they operate, and that sometimes it's easy to forget about all of the progress that happens, particularly in the context of several years, because entrepreneurs are always thinking big, and they're always, oh, I haven't done this yet, or they're constantly moving the goalposts. One thing in an earlier episode of the podcast, we talked with Venture Canada Fellow who recommends hype documents, which are basically, it's a running list of all your accomplishments that have kind of happened. And anyway, it's a great tool that I'll up again for our listeners, because I think it's something that is important for all people, just to celebrate the wins, particularly in the midst of this pandemic.
I fall in that category of perfectionism. And I think very often, some of my friends will be like, oh my gosh, let's celebrate, that you signed this deal. And I'm like, I'm not celebrating that I signed this deal. I'm celebrating once the impact is achieved, like what I'm going for. I want to solve the problem. And to me, that's the part worth celebrating. And sometimes I listen to myself say that, and I'm like, wait, that's a problem. I should be celebrating a little victory or a big victory or whatever. And so that's a very interesting tip that I might have to take on.
Yeah, it's so important to celebrate the wins, and and to not be too hard on oneself. I think is something, and have that self-compassion, I think is crucial. One thing that is also interesting about your business is that you've bootstrapped it, which means you haven't raised outside funding. So what advice do you have for entrepreneurs on how to bootstrap a company?
I think my journey as a bootstrapper has been fascinating because it wasn't necessarily a choice. It was like something that happened organically because of the way that the company was formed, and that, it wasn't an easy company to explain in a 3-minute pitch or something like that. And the questions were always coming about why we weren't focusing on this one product line rather than, diversifying from the get-go. And so I think it's also interesting because I'm a female founder, I'm a Latina founder. And so if I'm cognizant of the amount of, venture capital and angel funding that actually goes to founders like me, it's a very low number, right? So it's interesting to me that bootstrapping has become such a good word and such a, not a trendy word. When in reality, there are many people and many founders across Canada and across the world that they didn't really make that conscious choice. So the first thing is, that if you are a bootstrapper by choice, amazing, it's a great way to build a really strong foundation for a healthy company. And then if you're not there by choice, then I think the best tip I can give is that the second that you stop channeling all of your efforts into finding an investor and start channeling those efforts into finding your first customer, I think the moment where in my mind, I stopped thinking negatively about the inability to find an investor that really understood the vision, then I think at that point, that switches, it becomes a more empowering moment for you as a founder. And I think it's easier to start sort of selling to your customer because your customer will understand the benefits to them more so than an investor might understand the ROI in a couple of years if your vision is something that's a little bit incompatible with traditional funding mechanisms. And that's okay, because there are many types of funding opportunities and there are many businesses that require specific types of funding opportunities, and they all don't need to go down the venture route, right? And there are some companies that need it because they need liquidity to be able to scale fast, but a lot of other businesses, they can be healthy by just growing in a bootstrap manner. So I think the first piece is acknowledging why you're in this position of needing to bootstrap. And if it's, the reason that you think your business will become stronger because of it, then I think that's something that's really respectable. And I think that if it's a position that you sort of find yourself in by other contexts that may be beyond your control, that the acceptance component is really important so that you can start making decisions from the perspective of someone that really wants to be resourceful and creative. And then the next bit is to really find people around you that are going to be willing to support your vision. And even if they do this one favor for you, that one favor is really helping you work toward where you want to get to in the next couple of months. Because those targets are going to be really, really make or break when you're a bootstrap founder. You need to meet those targets constantly, and it's okay to ask for help to get there. And even if they do one small thing that moves you toward your target, that's enough. And you should be grateful for that, and you should continuously try to find people that will do that for you and that will help you get there, because no one can do it alone, right?
Agreed. And one point that I think is particularly important for our listeners to understand, particularly if they're aspiring entrepreneurs, is that probably 99.5% of companies are not suitable for venture capital. That the only companies that are really suitable for venture capital are companies that have the potential for huge financial returns, like 20, 30, X very quickly. That are these
or hardware.
Or hardware, or highly research and development intensive companies that require a huge amount of capital to kind of get going. And if you're a sort of a traditional business or your services company, it probably doesn't make sense in the early stages to raise outside capital. And part of it, the reason why it doesn't make sense is that the equity of your company is the cheapest at the very beginning when you're just getting going. So you don't want to be giving equity out to people when it's really cheap. You want to be giving equity, selling equity when it's really expensive, which is why some of the entrepreneurs who have by far the biggest personal financial sale or financial windfalls when they sell their company are the people who often held off taking any outside investment until they reach that more growth stage. And they say, okay, I need $200 million to scale this to become a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm going to raise the outside capital. And at something that has a valuation in the billions of dollars. So just more for our listeners is I think what Lucia is saying in terms of the importance of bootstrapping a business is really important. And not only can it help you financially benefit more, it also allows you to retain control of your company for longer, which is one of the reasons why people pursue entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And I think it's also like, it really depends on how purpose-centric you are, right? Like for us, we were in the early stages building really critical infrastructure for digital identification, which, involves very, very sensitive data. But if we're looking, down and our company is with these investors that are looking to maximize their ROI, then the nature of the data we were collecting can be monetized in ways that we weren't comfortable with in terms of the purpose of our company. So we were really weary of taking an external investment from people that would pressure us to go in a particular direction with some of the data we were collecting. We wanted to make it sovereign data to the user. So I think, there are many, many questions to ask when deciding to take on external investment. And I think that really the founder deep down knows the truth, and that we've done a terrible job as a startup industry in, equating the perceived status of a startup with how much money they're able to raise through dilutive equity, because really the most admirable companies, in my view, are the ones that have been able to resourcefully grow and protect their cap table because they knew that, down the line, this was going to make their business much more resilient.
A funding announcement can be a great sign. It's a sign a company has a lot of traction, but there's a lot of companies that raise a lot of money that end up being complete busts. And there's likewise, for instance, there's somebody who we recently had speak to Venture for Canada Fellows who founded a company called Geotab 20 years ago, immigrant from South Africa to Canada. And he founded Geotab shortly after immigrating to Canada. Today, Geotab has 1,500 employees, $400 million in annual revenue, and it's completely owned by him and the employees. They've never raised any outside capital. Point being is you can build like in 20 years is not a super long time horizon. Like a lot of times people think of 60-year-old family businesses that are still owned. In the span of 10, 20 years, somebody can still build a very large company without raising any outside investment.
And that's 20 years with old tech. Like now, new tech lets you build things much faster than you could before. So even that 20 years can be shortened just by using the right tools today.
One thing that probably stuck out to our listeners when I was going through your bio is you do a lot of different things, Lucia. You have a ton of different involvement. You are one of the busiest people that I know, and it is super impressive how you juggle a lot of different things at once. So one of the things I've been really thinking about and would love to ask you is, how do you manage your time and how do you manage all of those different commitments?
Did you hear that, Mom? I'm a really busy person. I can't respond to like every message, right? I'm teasing, but thank you. I appreciate that because I do pride myself in working really hard. And I think a big turning point for me was that the realization that it really was not about necessarily managing my time, but understanding how I manage my energy and the energy that I have to put into different things. And so for me, my brain, it's a curious brain. So it's really important for me to work on different types of projects. Like it does not suit me to do one single thing for long amounts of time. And so in understanding that about myself, maybe that's part of the reason why Emerge was really ambitious from the get-go. It was partially because it was a personality trait of mine. But in understanding, okay, that's how I prefer working, then I was able to sort of decide, well, I'm going to partition some of my days where I'm going to work out in the early morning, which I think is super important and you have to be consistent with. And then after that, I'm going to dedicate some days to just taking calls, and then some days to just doing deep work. I'm going to take Saturdays completely off because I need one day where I just pursue all of these like free interests that I have that have nothing to do with work maybe, or might be tangentially related in that they might inspire something at work, but I'll end up spending the day at a museum or reading a book or going to the beach or, on a boat or whatever. And so I think just understanding how to refuel my own energy and say, during the day, I have a slump in the afternoon. So I eat lunch and then I always have a slump. It doesn't matter if I'm eating super healthy, if I'm hydrated, doesn't matter. And I have coffee. There's like a moment in time in the afternoon that I have a slump. So I take a 20-minute nap every day. And then I wake up and I'm super energized, but it's just because I understood that during that moment in that day, it might be 20 minutes. Yeah, sure. In the middle of the workday, but at the same time, like I wake up super energized and I can go for a lot more hours. Right. So I think really understanding your body and your energy and the way that you can go about your day and trying to, give specific focus into different tasks. Once you understand the patterns of your body, then it becomes easier to say, I'm going to schedule my day around the way my own body and my mind work best, so that I can, potentially give the best of me throughout all these different things that you have to do. And then I have like very strict time blocks. So for example, for the things I sit on the board on, I do like 2-hour time blocks every 2 weeks so that I can give them some strategic hours. Then when I'm working on Emerge projects, I focus on specific projects and deadlines at a time. And I keep Tuesdays and Wednesdays 0 calls, usually. And just dedicate those days to like deep focused work. And then I take calls Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays. And I've worked that into my schedule. I use X.ai to manage my calendar, and it already knows not to schedule anything on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So that is what works for me. But I think the key piece that is hopefully something that listeners can take home with them is this notion of like, understand what works for you, not for your time, but for your energy. And then your time will become like how you spend your time will become obvious because of the way that you have maximized your energy.
Those are some great points. One thing I want to mention first is there's a great book called When by Daniel Pink, who's written a bunch of other great books. To Sell as Human is a great one I recommend too. But When talks a lot about the science of timing. And in particular, he writes about the importance of knowing, in essence, whether you're a morning person, night person, or kind of in between. And that for morning people, generally, it's exactly as you described, Lucia. The mid-afternoon is the slump. It's when they are the least productive. And to time, in essence, things that are very administrative, that require very little brain power into those times. Now, if you're a night person, it can be different, right? The morning can be the worst time, depending on the person. But really understanding each person has is a different biology and different times that work well for them. And knowing what times work for you, I think is something that's super important. For instance, right now it's 4:30 p.m. in the time where I am, which is right when I'm picking up energy. So this podcast, the timing works pretty well because I'm getting energized. I'm not a huge fan of doing podcasts at like 2:30 in the afternoon because tends to be energy period time when I'm a little bit more lower energy. So it's important.
But then what gives you energy, right? Because like for me, like speaking to other people gives me tons of energy. So actually this is time during my slump, but I'm feeling really energized because like talking to you is something that excites me. The topics that we're going to cover are exciting to me. And also I can like feed off other people's energy really well. And so for me, this is actually a perfect slump activity. Whereas for you, it's not, right? So it really goes to show that you just have to understand yourself and what works best for you in order to optimize how you spend your time.
And I think as an introverted person, that's one of the things is that I find in terms of how I prepare for these episodes, it requires me having lots of energy. I try to be very focused. Mm-hmm. And I think that's partly, it goes beyond energy. It's like, when does somebody have the most intellectual clarity in their head? And I find, at least for me, kind of 4 p.m. on, I have more mental clarity, or in the morning, versus 1 to like 3 p.m. I feel like my mind is not as sharp as it is at sometimes other points in the day. So it's an interesting, I agree that there's different kind of pros and cons. The other point that's interesting is about time blocking, which I actually recently started doing. And it's interesting. There's more research that backs up time blocking as like the most effective time management tool, way more effective than to-do lists, because to-do lists aren't time bound in a lot of it. They're just a list of stuff to do. And I think the other point that is important to note is that time blocking can be really helpful for creativity. An issue that I've had for a long time is just constantly having email and Slack open and just constantly responding to messages, which was really hurting my creativity because I wasn't able to do deep focused work. One of the real positives of time blocking is you can say, this is similar to what you do. This is uninterrupted creative time. No interruptions, no email, no Slack, just focusing on creative work. And I think it's something that can be really helpful. I recommend checking out Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is on this topic. And it's really interesting. There's also a great Paul Graham essay called Maker's Schedule versus Manager's Schedule that is kind of interesting to check out about why it's important to block off not just 30 minutes, but like 3-4 hour blocks for creative time, because that's where the best creative work takes place.
Yeah, I do Tuesdays and Wednesdays for deep work. Like it's a whole 2 days, right? But I think also the context switching is really draining. So if you're spending your day going from like, oh, I'm responding to an email about this, and then 5 seconds later, you have to completely change what your brain was thinking about and answer an email about something else, and then take a call about something else, just like over time, it drains you a lot more. So there are days when, in theory, I've done more work, but I end up less tired than the days that I have like fully scheduled calls and the context switching required for all of them. I finish the day completely exhausted and no one gets it. They're like, you were on the phone all day long. And I'm like, yeah, it was exhausting.
I completely agree. A few weeks ago, Lucia, I scheduled 7 30-minute back-to-back calls with all people who I've never chatted with before, all on different subjects on a Friday afternoon. So it went from 1:30 to 5. And by 5 p.m., I was like, I am never doing, actually, it was long. It was, I just was like, I can never do that. I'm never doing that again, because I just felt my brain was completely dead. So I agree. I think the context switching, it's also interesting. I've been doing some research on multitasking, and I, for a long time, was a really big multitasker. And interestingly, a lot of times I think people think multitasking makes them more efficient. But when you look at the research behind multitasking, it's that little bit of time just to switch between things. If you're doing multiple things at once, it actually wastes like 40% of your time. And that there's a transaction cost to switching. Like someone thinks they can do 2 things at once. In almost all cases, they can't. And they're actually just switching between things really quickly. So I think that your point is really important about beware of transaction costs when you're switching between activities.
Yes.
On the topic of personal development, you are also a big proponent of mind mapping. And I remember at the training camp that you attended, you did a session on mind mapping, and it's something that has resonated with a lot of your fellows. Can you describe mind mapping to our listeners?
I know, but the 2017 fellows are going to give like a deep sigh right now. They're like, again, she goes through it again. It's because I constantly talk about mind mapping and the impact it can have on a person's just overall well-being. For me, it was transformative. Like I remember I started doing it in maybe 2015 or 16. I was going through a really difficult stage in my life. And, it was just, I was working in a team that was doing a lot of like product innovation, and they were doing a lot of like growth experiments to figure out if we could tap into new markets. And every time we would take on one of these, we would like break a product down completely or a feature down completely. And it was just really interesting to see the parallels of how you can take, a person and do the same thing and try to break up all of these segments. And so to mind map, really what you're doing is you're drawing a picture of yourself at the center on a blank sheet of paper, and then writing out these categories of aspects of your life that are really important to you. So for me, I use things like, work and values, friendships, family, financial situation. I use things that relate to curiosity because I tend to be really, really, really curious about the world. And then I take 20 minutes and just write any word that comes to my mind for those 20 minutes. And it could be misspelled, it could be in the wrong place, it could be repeated, it doesn't really matter. But taking those 20 minutes and just downloading all of your brain is really, really powerful. And then, you want to do that a few times in different mindsets after a good day, after a bad day. You want to do it in the morning, in the evening. I've done it with tea, I've done it with whiskey, I've done it, in different frames of mind. And then the goal is really, you look at those mind maps and you say, what are these trends that are sort of popping up? And what is your subconscious trying to tell you about something that maybe you're not fully processing or something you need to think about more? For me, I've had I call them themes. So every year I come up with a list of different themes, and I base all of my resolutions around these themes that my subconscious is telling me hey, this is something that's really important to you right now. And I try to do these check-ins once a year. So I do a series of 6 mind maps before setting any meaningful resolutions each year. And then anytime that there's been a drastic change in my life, so if I've completely decided that I'm going to forego living anywhere and decide to be fully nomadic, that was a good time to check in, and just accounting for these major changes, because sometimes we don't know how things impact us until much later, and they seep out in different ways. So mind mapping is a way to really check in with yourself and build self-awareness in terms of what you're prioritizing in the next few months of your life, and how you can design certain targets so that they meet really why you want to do things, not just the fact that you want to do them. And the easiest example of success in that route is fitness for me. So initially, I was going to the gym, I was trying to go to the gym 5 to 7 times a week, which is, a lot. And for someone that didn't work out that consistently before, it was a big change. And I was having trouble sticking with it, because I would do it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then I would quit for, the same. And so when I started mind mapping, I discovered that the reasons why I was going to the gym, I was running on a treadmill, I was doing all of these things that you're supposed to do when you go to the gym. But the reason why I kept wanting to go to the gym was these themes that kept popping up in my mind maps were strength. And so I wanted to build strength. I wanted to feel strong. And running on a treadmill doesn't really build strength. It builds resistance and stamina and things, but not strength. And so I started taking martial arts classes, and then I was consistent for 3 years. And going right wherever I can. Now, obviously, the pandemic has changed that, but I'm still taking, some video classes. But the reason why I really wanted to do it, it was completely different than just wanting to do it. And so once I understood why, it was easier to tap into the right, goals to be able to be consistent with the things that I wanted to do. And so it's really a powerful tool, and I can't recommend it enough, obviously.
One quote that came to mind when you were describing mind mapping is by Carl Jung, the psychologist, where he talks about that if you don't understand your unconscious, you will let your unconscious mind control you and call it fate. And yes. I think it's something that's so important. It's to understand the why behind different things. Yeah. And that our minds are often not logical and do things that try to trick us. So it's important to take the time to reflect, because just relying on our gut instincts, there's so many cognitive distortions that everybody has, that it is really important to take that time to reflect. Even
what we feel is illogical and impulsive, there's a reason why that impulse came to be, right? It's not necessarily just impulse. It's that it was informed by things that perhaps you have not taken the time to process. And so you reacted naturally by something that was in your subconscious. And so I think it's really important to just take time and find out what's in there and figure out hey, is this worth bringing to the forefront of my life? And if it is, then how can I do it in a way that's really productive and helps me become a more fulfilled person? So I just love it as a tool to do that. And I think self-awareness is something that I try to take pride in, that I have built quite a bit, but it isn't by nature. It's the intention of constantly checking in with myself and trying to figure out why am I, behaving in this way? Why am I doing these things? Why do I want to do these things? And how do I take all of this that's in me and channel it into the right places so that I feel fulfilled as a person?
You recently tweeted, resilience is a muscle. It's something that needs to be worked out regularly. And I think that this relates to some of the previous topics that we talked about, including work-life balance. But how do you foster that sense of resilience? And in particular, given all of the different things that you do, at once, how do you foster that sense of resilience while kind of having that constant stress and pressure and constantly striving to do more?
I think I've become a lot better at the stress component. I think I'm very energized constantly, but I also think that I've done better at saying, I'm going to stress about this because it's actually something worth stressing about. It's within my control to address. Whereas I'm going to let go of stressing about things that perhaps are not within my control. And making that intentional choice has been very difficult, but also it's been very healthy for me as a person, because I used to just get very stressed about a lot of things, very anxious about a lot of things. I think the reason I tweeted that was I was giving a talk to a group of high schoolers in Florida for my sister, my half sister. She's a guidance counselor in Florida, and she works with children of newly landed immigrants, and they often have a language barrier, and so they're struggling to fit in and catch up with school and things like this. And so, you know, I was giving that talk, and resilience kept coming up as a theme. And the reason for that is, you know, I do think it's a muscle, and I think in great part, it's really important that we understand that entrepreneurs are like constantly hard on themselves. Like, we are constantly trying to strive for perfection. We want everything done to a T. We try to do things ourselves if we feel someone else can't do them to the degree that we want them done. And I think, like, the tighter we hold on to that, I think the more we're capable of like self-sabotaging and becoming barriers to our own success. And so I think the moment that you start accepting that failure is okay, that things don't have to be perfect, that's when you start really exercising that muscle a little bit, because resilience is what's going to tell you, hey, I failed. It's not that big a deal. I'm going to fix it now, or I'm going to get someone, you know, else to help me fix it, or I'm going to do all of these things to address the failure rather than prevent the failure from occurring in the first place. So the change of attitude that takes place from saying, I'm never going to fail, to saying, oops, failed again, here's how I fix it, and fix it fast, then that change, I think, is what really starts to tap into that muscle and build that resilience, and saying, there's nothing that can happen to me and I will be thrown off by. I might be thrown off for a second, but then I'm going to, like, you know, exercise my muscle and try to figure out how to fix it, whether it's by myself or with other people. But I think really that change in attitude and saying, it's not that I'm trying to prevent failure, it's that I'm like moving toward my goalposts, and then, you know, if failure comes along the way, I'm just going to deal with it, handle it, and make sure that my team is handling and that they have everything they need to handle these things as well. Then I think that's really what I meant with that tweet. And I think it's something that entrepreneurs struggle to accept. Obviously, you know, I'm looking at this in hindsight of who I was in 2018 and who I am today. And until 2018, I was trying to prevent failure, and now I'm like constantly failing all the time. I've stopped apologizing for a lot of it. Like, sorry if I haven't gotten back to you yet. But the key really there was that change in attitude and saying, like, actually, it is a muscle, and I get better and more adaptable at solving problems the more I have problems to solve. It's not that I'm looking for them, but I'm not afraid of them anymore.
There's a really important distinction, I think, between perfectionism and healthy striving. And I recently wrote an op-ed on this, so it's something that comes to mind very, very kind of clearly, is that, you know, perfectionists in general view that, as the name perfectionism indicates, everything needs to be perfect, and that failure is a bad thing. And that they can't make any kind of mistakes. And they also place more emphasis on the outcome than the journey. I think healthy strivers recognize, they set high standards, but they recognize that failure is a part of life, that it's going to happen, that everybody is inherently flawed. And that means everybody inherently makes mistakes. And that the journey matters as much as the outcome. And that in a lot of cases, even if we put all of our effort in, there's way more luck in life than people, in most cases, are willing to accept. And that means that that focus on the journey, because that's what you can control. Don't focus on the outcome. And I think that has been a running theme through a lot of the podcast episodes, but I think it's something that's really important for people, because I think our school system conditions us on the outcome: get a good grade, you know, get into X university. But the journey is so important.
I think just in the early stages of entrepreneurship, and I remember making so many mistakes in the early days because I was so concerned of making sure everything was perfect, that I presented the perfect pitch, that I, you know, wrote out this proposal or this plan in the perfect way, that I said everything in the right way, and so on and so forth. And it was really like, it was a moment of, you know, I wish if I could go back, I would wish I knew this sooner, because it was one of those things where you become the obstacle in your own way by saying, I need to do things in a certain way. It prevents you from asking for help sooner. It prevents you from tapping into people that want to help. It's just that you don't know how to give them what they need in order to help you. I think it's just a big barrier in your own way. So I think the sooner that, you know, and the earlier that people can start looking into themselves and saying, like, hey, you know, fine, it'll be fine if I make a mistake, it'll be fine if it's not perfect. Like, hey, I can send a correction, that's fine. Like, it's, you know, nothing, the world isn't going to end because I had to send a correction. That's fine. So I think those moments are really the ones that start to exercise this resilience muscle, because then it's like, well, I made a mistake. What do I do? Cool, I'll send a correction. And then it becomes much more of a natural instinct. And then the more you practice it, the easier it is to sort of just be a resilient, strong person and build a resilient organization and company.
And that mistakes happen. And that once a mistake's taken place, you can't change it. You can learn from it.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't change it. It's happened. It's the past. And I think that's something that's really like, don't agonize over it because focus on the future and learn from it. But it's really important to not kind of agonize over past mistakes. And I think that this, a challenge I've seen through my work at Venture for Canada is this increasing rise of perfectionism. And as a perfectionist, as a attempted reformed perfectionist, I think it's a really important point for people and for our listeners, many whom are young Canadians, to really think about is try not to be a perfectionist. Even though society puts a lot of pressure on you to be a perfectionist, even though your parents might put pressure on you to be a perfectionist, even though you put pressure on yourself to be a perfectionist, like let go of the perfectionism. And sometimes also don't feel the need to be productive all the time. Like to Lucia's point, I love the concept of like a Sabbath. Like take one day a week where you literally, it's just for yourself and unplug. Don't check anything. And some nights just watch a bunch of Netflix because you want to. Like I think we live in, particularly an entrepreneurial ecosystem, pressure for people to constantly be productive. And as Lucia does all this stuff, as you've talked about Lucia, but you also carve out time just to chill. And that's important. And it's important people don't feel guilty about that.
Yeah. And that was a very hard learning lesson for me, because I used to work 7 days a week. And then I would expect employees to take a day off or 2 or 3. And then they'd be like, well, no, I'd rather not. And I realized that I was setting the worst example for them, because if I never take time off, then even if I permission unlimited vacation as a company policy, if I don't set the standard for what that means, and if I don't say, hey, I'm going to take a vacation when I need it, then like there's no sense in, in having that policy, because I'm not creating the culture that accompanies that policy. So I actually didn't do that for myself. I did it for the people that worked with me, to make sure that they felt comfortable taking their days off. And then in the process, sort of realized that it was a very healthy thing for me to do. And I've come to love my Saturdays. I think people are afraid of emailing me on Saturdays now, but it's really just this idea of like, you are so lucky to have a place in the world with privilege, and, to go to a museum or to go for a walk or to do something fun or to escape, in a sense of the world, like escape some of your responsibilities for a brief amount of time. Like that's something that you shouldn't take for granted, because there are many people in the world that can never escape their realities, right? So it's almost like we have at least to me, it feels like I have a sense of obligation to not just be committed to solving these like really big problems, but also saying along the way, like, hey, there's a life to be lived here, and I'm so lucky to be able to live it. Makes me a better entrepreneur, I think, too.
I agree. And then sometimes it's just important to live in the moment and just sit in the sun or go to the beach and play with a pet and just kind of just enjoy it, because we only have one life. And one reflection I've had as well, Lucia, is in the early days of Venture for Canada, I would send emails every day I was on vacation. I would send emails on the weekend all the time. I would send emails after hours all the time. And one of the things I realized is I was setting a bad tone for everybody in the organization. I was setting a tone of perfectionism and workaholism. Yeah. And one of the things I've recently, actually in the last month, started to do is no emails on the weekend. I don't even check it. I specifically by 5 p.m. I'm like, no email to Monday. And frankly, it's really hard for me to do it. Like, I feel like I'm an addict. Like I'm trying to stop myself from check. And I actually have consistently not done it for a month. But I'd say that I think it sets such a healthier tone with people who work with me that I don't do that, because ultimately the CEO sets a tone. And the other thing too is I also just feel a lot more refreshed and creative. I feel more creative than I've been in a long time, because I'm not checking. And the thing I realized is that, so 5 p.m. I'd stop checking email, and then Monday I check it and I might have 30, 40 emails, of which maybe 6 or 7 require responses. And before I would check my email maybe 20 times on the weekend. And one of the things I realized is hey, if something's urgent, call or text me, right? Like it's not that I'm not that important that I need to be checking my email 20 times over the weekend.
And
And
people
that's
that
more,
need to reach you will reach you. People that need to reach you will reach you.
and it's more me not being comfortable with uncertainty by me constantly needing to check email than it is any actual logical need for me to be constantly checking email. And all it does is cause anxiety by all the different kind of staff members. So it's to say there's certain jobs, yes, you do need to check it, like the very few ones. If you're like running something urgent that's 24/7, and you know what, maybe there's some jobs, but 99% of jobs, you don't need to check your email on the weekend. And yeah, it's an important thing, I think, for people. I wish I had gotten that advice to myself when I was 22. I think I would have saved myself some heartache and some needed stress. So just on a final question, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, Lucia. You are a voracious reader and somebody who is constantly reading. As we often talk about at training camp in the first year, where you got me a great book, Comandante, on Hugo Chavez and kind of politics of Venezuela. And I've always known, in the 4 years since we've met each other, how voracious of a reader you are. So what are 3 books that you recommend to our listeners and why?
I think that book was really interesting, by the way, Comandante, because it showed how he used monetary policy to really push his agenda. And it was quite devastating to read, in my opinion, because it was just like a really well thought out strategy of how to use money really to, I guess, like push himself onto all of these different public institutions and weaken them from inside. I still remember that book. It's a good book. Yeah, you're a voracious reader too. So this question, I'm trying to think of books that maybe you haven't already recommended to VFC Fellows. But I think the most impactful book that I've read in the past few years has been Half the Sky. Half the Sky is written by a married couple. They're both journalists that have been reporting on women's issues for a very long time. They're both award-winning, and the book is award-winning, and it started off a whole movement. But essentially what it does is it tells stories of women that are in situations of oppression around the world, and each case is a different form of oppression. And then it talks about the ways in which economic freedom and economic opportunity can go and sort of lift them out of these situations of oppression. And so it's a very difficult book to read because the first chapter in each set, in each case, is about the forms of oppression, and some of those are really difficult to just process as a human being. But then the other chapter is a much more, inspiring read, because it talks about all of these different ways in which we can enable people to come out of different situations of oppression. And for me, it was a book that it's not, I guess, related to the startup world. It's not related to technology, but it's one of those books that just makes you think about like the human impact of the things that we build as, creators. And I think that it also makes me think, a lot more holistically about how to design something with real intention behind it and real potential impact behind it, because it's thought about the different lived experiences of potential users. And so I think for me, it was really a book about empathy and intelligent empathy when designing products and things like that. And it's something I've taken on in my company quite strongly. The other book I was completely fascinated by that I've read recently is called Prisoners of Geography. It's a fantastic book that gives you 10 maps of the world and then sort of walks you through the geologic and geographic components of those areas and how those components inform foreign policy. And I think that's a fascinating thing, because so often we reduce foreign policy to societal issues, to cultural issues, to politics. It's very, in this era of saying, hey, we are, we're moving along these like lines of extremes, and people can't sort of seem to come together if they disagree on something. I think understanding that there are more factors than just opinion and personal perspective and personal belief, that there are actually geographic reasons why certain things have gone the way they have. I think it was a very interesting read to sort of put the world into perspective. And I think the more connected we are and the more of the world that we see, even if it's through a book, I think the better we are able to find our place in the world. And the better we are able to design the types of companies that belong in the world and belong with people around the world. So I think those 2 books have been the most impactful. As for the third one, I guess this is like off the beaten path because it's not even a book, it's a journal, but I'm going to go with the gratitude journal. it is technically a book, right? Because actually, I just find that it's a really healthy practice, and I've been exactly. See, you have it. I think I just want to give that one because I know sometimes for people like the person I was in 2018, it's really hard to find ways to become meditative, to take first steps towards self-awareness, to take first steps towards just like building the kinds of internal mental tools that you need to become a better entrepreneur. And that book for me was one of the things that just like helped put me on a path of just sitting down and like reflecting for the day, thinking a little bit about, you know, what I'm grateful for, my place in the world, my intention for tomorrow. So I think it's just a really helpful thing. I was going to say a book you should read, but actually I think this is a better recommendation just because of, you know, sometimes we all need help trying to get on a path toward mental health. And this is an easy tool that can help put you on that path. So I hope it's useful to people that take it on as a recommendation.
I love a gratitude journal as well. It's called, for our listeners, it's called the 5-Minute Journal. You can buy it easily online. And for Adventure for Canada, we actually around a month ago decided to offer all staff to be able to purchase this and expense it to VFC. Because I think it was an investment, or it is an investment in employees' mental health. And I actually started doing it in middle of March when I was definitely feeling kind of some of the COVID blues. And I think it's in something that has been super helpful. Although there's a certain types of questions like there's a certain questions for our listeners you have to fill out every day. Like, what are 3 things you're grateful for? What are 3 things that make this a great day? And one fun thing that's kind of funny in lockdown is that because the days are sometimes quite similar, is that the things are very similar every day. So sometimes I'm like playing with my cat, my partner, going for a walk. So it's going to be very interesting to look at this years from now and see, oh, I had some very similar entries for like many days because my days were very, very similar. But I'm a big fan of gratitude journals, and there's a lot of science backing up that just doing this on a daily basis can make you. It's not like a silver pill that can just take away depression and so I don't oversell it, but for most people it is a really easy to implement habit that can make you more grateful.
Yeah, and for me it was just like a first step, right? It was saying like it didn't come naturally to me at the time, and it mental health and self-awareness building didn't come naturally to me at the time except for mind mapping. So I just wanted to build like ways to incorporate that into my day, and I found that so helpful as a very simple way to do that. So I just think if you're struggling with a place to start, then that might be an easy place to start, or a relatively easy place to start. And then it becomes a question of like, maybe you can challenge yourself so that your entries don't look the same every day. And so, maybe today you choose to play like a card game with your partners just so that you could, be a little grateful for an extra something that made your day a little more special than yesterday.
I agree. I think I need to make it a little bit more creative than sometimes I was just putting the similar things as grateful for, or I can't just put things that make today great, a walk, as sort of thing. So that's good advice, Lucia.
Specificity. Like I saw something on my walk and I'm grateful for what I saw on the walk. Like I think the other day I was out for a walk with my nephew and I was playing this, he was with a friend. And so we were playing this game of, like a search, I guess. I can't remember what the name is, like a scavenger hunt. And so we were going on this walk and I'd be like, find me a white rock, find me a gray rock, find me a black rock, find me a red flower. And I just like kept looking for all of these things. And they would get so excited about red flowers and finding blue flowers. And every piece of trash they picked up on their walk was a bonus point toward a prize. And so I think like, it's just, the pandemic in many ways, like, yeah, it's sad that we have to say a walk is the most exciting part of the day, but also like if looking at it through the eyes of a child, like it really can unleash a lot of creativity and imagination on our part today. It's required almost so that we can make it through this kind of like real difficult time. And so I would hope that a gratitude journal would inspire people to say, like, hey, how privileged am I that I get to be home and that I get to take this walk because, I'm currently in Honduras, as you know, and the health system here is completely collapsed. And there are so many people that are suffering in Colombia today because of the political situation there in, all different parts of the world. And so it's really something that is present on my mind. And as I go through the pandemic and as I write in that journal, I just like, and as I read books about the world and sort of keep track of the news, you sort of figure out that your place in the world right now is a happy one, despite all of the difficulty, right?
Agreed. And that there's a lot of, I think one of the things a lot of people have reflected on during the pandemic is just the little joys of going for a walk outside or gardening, and just slowing down and kind of appreciating the little things of life. And I actually have gotten more joy out of walking and running than I think I have ever have in my entire life. And
you're like 20 pages grateful for it.
Yeah, exactly. I am actually very appreciative of all the walks. And a lot of one thing that has graced my gratitude journal a lot lately is the spring, which is especially in Canada where it's quite cold in the winter. It is really nice, and I probably appreciate the spring this year, even though it's quite rainy, more than other years. And I think just practicing that gratitude is super important. And it relates to the perfectionism conversation that we had earlier, right? I think that the more gratitude you have for little things, the more that you can overcome, I think, challenges and have that sense of resiliency. Lucia, it has been a pleasure chatting today. We touched a lot of different topics, including gratitude journals, time management, no emails on the weekend, how your story of launching Emerge and the exciting work that you're doing with UN SDGs. What are UN SDGs? A really wide range of different topics. Lucia, you are a remarkable person, and I've seen that since we first met 4 years ago. Really excited to see what you continue to do, and as Emerge continues to grow. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk with you again, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.